Warning, this podcast contains spoilers for the limited series Moon Knight on Disney+. A bunch of stuff from Moon Knight comics, also West Coast Avengers, some Spider-Man No Way Home, and Marvel movies in general. We're stepping out of the airlock to dive deeper into the world of Moon Knight. Rosie, what did you think of this episode?
I feel like this was always going to be a complex...
It's going to be tough to start.
It was going to be tough to start, and there are some things about the show and kind of the representation of Stephen that I didn't love. I felt like his struggles were kind of played for laughs, and I felt like people were a little bit mean to him, and I'm just a sweet guy who likes nice stuff. So I was like, but it's doing the thing that the thing that gives me hope is it's doing the thing that all my favorite MCU shows do, which is it's really deeply taking from some incredibly weird comics and some old comics. Weird. So it's very much in the vein of Hawkeye and WandaVision in deeply taking stuff and plucking out characters and reimagining them. And I will always respect any superhero show that only shows like 5 seconds of a superhero suit. Yeah. I think that is very brave. What did you think about it?
Here's the thing about Moon Knight. We've said this before on the podcast. Moon Knight is a character that I think you could argue is about vibes, purely about vibes. There's never, and your mileage may vary. If someone feels differently and has a different opinion, that's absolutely valid. But having read all of the Moon Knights, there's not really like a Hammer Moon Knight story. There's not like the iconic Moon Knight tale, the great Moon Knight story. The character has been significantly changed almost every time he's appeared. You know, from his first appearance in his solo in Werewolf by Night to his solo titles to his then revamped solo titles, West Coast Avengers, and his several other launch solo titles after his appearances in West Coast Avengers. He's changed almost every time. And there's never really been that great arc. I think mainly because he also doesn't have, like, his early villains were very problematic. And he doesn't really have that great foil to fight. So it was interesting, at least for me, to reflect on how Moon Knight Episode 1 was very much how I would imagine an adaptation of Moon Knight taking place. It was pretty messy. It was all about vibes. There was something kind of really intriguing about it. And I'm interested to see where it goes. I think that there's a chance for this to be really, really interesting in the way that it intersects with the kind of ongoing and existing MCU, which we're going to talk about shortly. But first, let's talk about who some of these people we're seeing here are. Yeah. Some of these characters.
I actually think your villain, you're kind of talking about like the foil and everything. That's a really good place to launch off, because what Moon Knight does here is it essentially creates wholesale a new villain for Moon Knight. Now, Arthur Harrow was in one issue. He was in one issue ever. But this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. The show opens, right? And immediately it is just filled with Arthur Harrow Easter eggs. So when we first meet Arthur Harrow in the show, he's playing with the idea of pain. He's filling his shoes with a broken glass, you know. And in the original comic where he debuted, he was a scientist who was continuing Nazi experiments based on the idea of pain theory. And he was in the Yucatan in this Mayan temple. It's a very problematic issue, like a lot of that older stuff, the representation of different kinds of people. But the temple, once again, you get that immediate deep cut. So it's not that Arthur Harrow didn't exist, but what they're doing is they're taking this name and this one appearance and expanding it into something larger. And I think that's really interesting. And obviously, like, it's Ethan Hawke. Who doesn't want to see him get to kind of redefine this space? And something else that I think is really interesting about this is it is the most prominent time that we've seen Marvel do something that they've started to do, especially Hawkeye. We talked about it a lot. They take these names of famous Marvel characters and they recontextualize who they are as usually background characters. And that happened with Hawkeye's cosplaying crew, his LARPing crew, right? we see them take a minor character who appeared in one issue and recontextualize it as a main villain. And that's something we're going to see in Multiverse of Madness as well with Gargantos, who was only in a couple of issues. So I think that's really interesting. And I'm always interested in a story that explores like the mentality of cults and how they play on the vulnerable and how they take advantage. And that definitely seems like what Ethan's Arthur Harrow seems to be playing into that with Mark and kind of trying to take advantage of Stephen feeling vulnerable and lost. So I think that is an interesting take. And we touched on Crawley, who's played by Sean Scott. So we think he's probably going to become an ally to Stephen.
I would imagine when we get into the back half of this series, we will see more of Crawley.
Yeah. And so then we get into some really interesting stuff that kind of jumps off the Moon Knight Hawkeye crossover kind of stuff. So Stephen's mean boss in the museum, who makes him do inventory, is credited as Donna, played by Lucy Thackeray, and she's like a very funny, like English, like sassy character, right? Now in the comics, this is another likely nod to a Moon Knight character from the Mark Spector Moon Knight series, which was the 90s Moon Knight series. And she was introduced in issue 39, a woman called Donna Kraft, who's basically Mark Spector's head publicist at his huge corporation that he owns called Spector Corp. So they kind of rejigged that here, where she's just his boss at the museum. But as we'll talk about later with theories, I also think there's some argument of like, is the museum what we're really seeing? Or is it a version of Spector Corp that Mark might have perhaps created to keep an eye on Stephen when he's away? And also in another, we'll talk about this too, but like her first appearance is in an issue with where Doctor Doom challenges Mark, to go to the Latvierian consulate and in this kind of quest for a stolen relic. And that will become relevant.
We will talk about that more in a moment.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest questions people are going to have coming out of this is at the end, you mentioned, you know, we hear him on the phone to this person who doesn't sound English.
Yeah.
Oh my God, you're alive. What's wrong with you, Mark?
Why did you call me Mark?
Who is called Layla, and in the credits we see that she's called Layla El Faoli. And there is not a Marvel character who has that direct name. But there are multiple kind of... The first most obvious one that I think if people have read Moon Knight comics, they will probably realize that she seems to be... likely will become a stand-in for Marlene, who is Moon Knight's on-again, off-again kind of lover, partner in crime, fellow adventurer, and some promo shots have kind of hinted at that. But there's some other things as well. There's a Marvel character called Layla, who was in the Moon Knight comics, who was more of kind of like a mob boss, so that seems a little bit less likely, but worth mentioning, because they like to roll stuff in.
Yeah.
I think... Okay, so we'll do the most outlandish one before I do the most realistic one.
Yeah, let's do the the outlandish
So
one.
the most outlandish one is a lot of people were like, well, the only famous Marvel Layla is Layla Miller.
Which would be totally wild and crazy.
Layla Miller is a mutant known as Butterfly from House of M and has been in X Factor. And
she when House of M went down, she had kept her powers and also was able to kind of like she was a creation of House of M that survived post the dissolution of House of M.
And so like, you know, that's a character who has connections to Doctor Doom.
Yeah.
But like the reality is in this kind of grounded, dark show where the thing that really seems to be relating and like speaking to people about this first episode is the kind of slightly more real take and a bit more of that Batman element. I don't necessarily know if this is where they're going to introduce, you know, just casually like introduce a mutant. So I think the most realistic thing that would fit into the trend that Marvel has been doing of late, which is where they recontextualize a character who in the past was like at best kind of a stereotype. And there is a character called the Scarlet Scarab who there's been two people who've held the mantle, Abdul Fahul, not Fahuli, but it's similar. And then his son Mehmet. And that has been a character who was like briefly a villain and then briefly kind of heroic and was an adventurer and has a lot of ties to Egypt. So I think if they're going to go anywhere with that character, they're probably going to do a recontextualization of the Scarlet Scarab where Layla is this powerful adventurer who wants to kind of reclaim the things that have been stolen through colonialism and all that kind of stuff, which is really cool.
Right. Yeah,
and
I
is
agree.
also what people... Do you remember when everyone wanted to, like, cast Oscar Isaac as Indiana Jones? And they were like, just do it where he's Indiana Jones, but he's stealing the stuff back.
Yeah.
And I was like, that sounds good. So I think they're going to play a little bit with that.
Rosie, let's talk about theories. Our theories about what is possibly going on. So I had texted you as I was watching this. And, well, first of all, we should say that in recent iterations of the character, Mark Spector, the Moon Knight, has been depicted as someone who is suffering from a form of dissociative personality disorder, DID, formerly called multiple personality disorder. This kind of evolved over time. Originally, as you noted, Moon Knight had a number of aliases that he used to kind of like break down class structure and allow him to understand like what was going on in the criminal underworld, right? He had a cab driver character, he had his millionaire/billionaire rich guy character, and then he had like some other ones. That eventually
it's like it's kind of changed. So originally they said it was like psychic trauma from connecting with Khonshu, split his personalities. In the 90s, they would kind of occasionally refer to it as schizophrenia.
Right.
And then the first time that it was really like DID as dissociative identity disorder was like in the mid-zeros when Bendis brought him into the Ultimate Universe. And from there, it just kept evolving and went from kind of a narrative device to some people actually like explored it as part of who he was. And that has been like a core tenet of the character under many different names.
Yes. Now, I think we both agree that I would not be surprised if they don't. Now, they brought in a DID consultant, and they've talked about that in some pre-show interviews. I think that is probably, could easily be wrong, but I think that's probably just a bid to be responsible about the depiction. And I think really what's going on here, and I'm judging by the fact that Moon Knight's costume just appears like out of nowhere, right? I think what we're seeing here is some sort of multiversal convergence, some sort of action like that. We had talked previously in our Loki episodes about this idea of nexus beings, these beings who like act as convergence points throughout the multiverse. They're the same throughout the multiverse. And I think maybe there's something like that going on here. Notably, the Scarlet Witch is one of these very important nexus beings. But I think maybe there's something like that going on here where you have different versions of the person who is Mark Spector or Stephen Grant. And those different multiversal versions are converging on the same body and sharing the same body. And that is why we get like this costume like appearing out of nowhere and stuff like that. I think that's probably what we're seeing.
I think that you're right. And this is something I always recommend to everyone who watches these shows. If you wait till the end of the movie or the end of the show, aside from probably getting some kind of stinger sometimes, you can see the special thanks. And that's where we get to kind of pay our respects to the creators who enabled these stories to be told. And the special thanks in these Marvel shows have been very telling. In the first episode of WandaVision, they thanked Olivier Coipel and Brian Michael Bendis, and that was how we worked out that House of M was probably going to be a really big influence. So there are secrets built in there. And at the end of the first episode of Moon Knight, they thank Jim Kruger, Alex Ross, Doug Braithwaite, all three of whom worked on a book called Universe X, which featured a different universe version of Mark Spector, who got his powers through vibranium. They also did design the mummy-style suit, so there's other reasons, but it's very interesting that they famously designed this different Mark Spector from a different Earth. Then you also have Bill Sienkiewicz, famous Moon Knight creator, absolute comic book artist icon. But in one of his What If issues, he played with the idea that Mark Spector was from a different universe and he had 3 different alters. And then we also have Jeff Lemire, who has obviously was the author of one of the most popular current kind of takes on Moon Knight and his mental health, but also has actually created multiple multiversal Moon Knights just alone, just him. So that I think that there's a very fun and good argument to make there. I think it's important that they brought in consultants and were thoughtful about the representation.
Right.
I didn't it didn't speak to me as someone who is always thinking about that kind of stuff. I didn't feel like it was what I hoped it would be, but I have seen a lot of people who it really spoke to and they really related to it, and I think that that's really important and cool. So I think it's really good they did that, and you can't really do Moon Knight without doing that because of the history of the character. But I do feel like from this first episode and the fact that the DID is not actually mentioned in the context of the show of the first episode, and there's only 6 episodes, they don't have a Doom Patrol level of 3 seasons or Legion amount of episodes to really explore what DID means, how it happens, the trauma that causes it. So I think that a multiversal idea of Mark essentially, or Steven, struggling with multiple versions of himself from multiple different universes is actually very likely. And also it would tie into Kang. It would tie into the multiversal kind of mayhem that Marvel is really leaning into at the moment. And it would make a lot of sense because these iterations, these versions of Mark and Steven are very different. Yes. And the struggle, if this had been going on his whole life, you feel like maybe there would be some empathy from people who knew him, or he would have been able to access some kind of help. But it feels, he doesn't seem to have the words to describe it. He talks a lot about needing help.
Recent.
It feels recent. And I think that would be a really smart way of looking at the struggle of all these different people. And also, like, we know now that from What If, that what happened in Loki, the different timelines, that did affect the main MCU. So there's a chance that these Mark Spectors from different universes have either been pruned and so need somewhere else to exist, or now exist because of split timelines.
Right. I think that this is, if I had to bet, I would say that this is not the quote-unquote 616 MCU time. This is taking place, what we're mostly seeing is taking place in some kind of offshoot pocket universe.
Yeah.
That will then, elements of which will then be brought into the main MCU. Now, I'm glad that you mentioned Kang, our multiversal big bad introduced in the Loki series, is going to play such a large role in Phase 4. How we don't know, because we mentioned the Alpine location.
Yes.
Now, there is very, very clearly, Marvel is like playing with the idea that could be Latveria.
Yes.
The kingdom, the nation kingdom ruled by Dr. Doom, Victor Von Doom. They're really teasing us with that. They're teasing us with that.
If you've ever read a comic that has Latveria in it, and I wrote an article about this at Nerdist that you can go and read that has visual imagery. If you've ever read a comic about Latveria and you've seen an image of it, it is a Bavarian alpine town that in the mountains has a huge castle, carved out of it. That is called Castle Doom. That little city is called Doomstadt, and it is in Latveria, where Dr. Doom was born, then left, then went back to reclaim his kind of like kingship or presidency or whichever version. And that, look, we are not out here saying like this is confirmed. But
I mean there's a world where there's a world where this is like a pre Dr. Doom Latveria alternate dimension, but they're clearly playing with it. They want you to think that.
There was even that moment in the trailer where like loads of people reported on it, then loads of people reported that it wasn't true. And it's just a funny, there's the cupcake truck that he steals during the mountain car chase. It's for a company called like Von Drumberg or something. But people saw the Von D and they were like, oh my gosh. And then it was really funny because everyone was like, it was not that. But now you watch the episode and you're like, oh, but they want you to have this conversation. They want you to 100%. Say, is it? And also, like we said, Moon Knight he's tangled with Dr. Doom. There's that 2-issue arc 39 and 40 in Mark Spector Moon Knight in the 90s where he kind of has this entanglement with Dr. Doom and they play on a little bit of both of their sides, kind of both sides of their kind of like anti-heroism. Like, could they be a hero? Could they be a villain? And I think that's really interesting. Also, in that issue, Doom is kind of approaching Mark about a relic that he stole, a Latvierian relic. And in this, we see Mark there with the scarab, a relic that he's stolen, a relic that is also, in another good comic book nod, is like directly from the comics. Mark is, after he loses the power of Khonshu, he meets the priests of Khonshu, and they end up giving him these relics, including a scarab that give him his power. So,
now, go ahead.
Finish.
Okay, so here's what I was going to say. So Kang, of course, our Phase 4 big bad introducing Loki. Kang, as we talked about in our Loki episodes, and it's important to reiterate, Kang is a time traveler who, through his extensive time traveling, has just accrued extreme amounts of knowledge and expertise about the way the universe works, the fabric of the universe, and just understands how to kind of play reality like an orchestra. Now, a different version, a variant of Kang in the Marvel Comics canon is Doctor Doom. Doctor Doom is a version of Kang in one universe. Also a version of Kang, Reed Richards. I'm just going to put this out here right now as a thing that could happen. Jonathan Majors, Kang, playing both Doctor Doom and Reed Richards. It's on the table.
I would love to see it.
It could happen.
Absolutely. I think that Jonathan Majors' iconic Kang casting just can't get enough of that final Loki episode. That would be incredible. And I think that they made a statement as soon as you cast Jonathan Majors as Kang, you introduce the probability and the likelihood that Reed will be black. And that's a world I want to live in. And I think having all three of those characters as black characters in the MCU would be super interesting. And if they were brave enough to do all three played by Jonathan, I would love it.
It would be insane. It would be so good.
It would there's lots of easy ways to tie it in. When Doctor Doom first appeared, he appeared as a time travel villain who was constantly like traveling around and causing chaos. And then to bring the Moon Knight context back to it, Kang has an ancient Egyptian period where he's Rama-Tut,
So, right. So just to quickly reset on this. So Kang lived in the 30th century, and he was just like really bored with life in the 30th century because it was too peaceful. And he discovers a time machine. He starts traveling around. The very first place he ends up going is ancient Egypt, where he then becomes the ruler. He names himself Rama-Tut. And he rules for a large amount of time. He hides like a time machine in the fucking Great Pyramid, and he gets up to all kinds of trouble. He tussles with the Fantastic Four. Yeah. And he messes around with the West Coast Avengers after they get hurled throughout time into like 6 different timelines. Some of the West Coast Avengers end up hanging out in ancient Egypt, where they have this adventure against Rama-Tut. Now, here's another interesting tie-in. So Kang is Rama-Tut, remember that, a variant of Rama-Tut. While Hawkeye is trapped in 2149 BC, he happens into the Temple of Khonshu, not understanding what the importance is, and he's just like, he ends up through different turns of events, because he kind of takes a liking to the defenders of the Temple of Khonshu. He carves these little, the Moon Knight moon batarangs, the moonerangs, and different kind of like projectile weapons for the people of Khonshu. In other words, Hawkeye in 2149 BC designed Moon Knight's
scarab darts.
He made his weapons, which is another crazy little thing to it. So all of which is to say, I wonder if at the end of this we get some sort of Rama-Tut, Kang, Doctor Doom hint, some kind of drop about that brings us into the stuff that we know we're going towards. Because otherwise, what is this series building towards? That's the thing I keep thinking. Mm-hmm. What is it here to do? Clearly, multiverse is the order of the day. Does that get us to Kang? I think that there's a chance.
I do too, and I think that it's like important. You guys have heard us talk about Kang a lot, but like Kang is because he's from the future. He is a descendant of Reed Richards' father.
Yes.
And that's kind of why those three are all seem so connected. I feel like we talked a lot about Marvel horror. Is this going to lead to Marvel horror, the MCU, horror in the MCU? That is definitely the big picture kind of situation.
Moon Knight made his debut in Werewolf by Night.
Yeah, we're going to have the Werewolf by Night kind of werewolf to be named Halloween special. We know Blade is in the MCU now, also connected to Britain and British museums, and in the comics has a London set origin story. And I just never saw it coming that they would do like a Latveria tease, but now they did it. I'm like, this makes so much sense. Like the really connection is there, and these are the kind of things that we love about watching these shows. Even if in like a month the showrunner's like, it was just the Alps, we can all be like, well, that was fun.
That was still fun. I mean, this is why we get into it. Now, here's the other. You mentioned like the crazy version of who Layla could be. I'm going to go with a crazy version of a possible theory here. When I think Egypt and Marvel, I think the really kind of like the original mutant and iconic X-Men supervillain Apocalypse, who it just so happens was played by Oscar Isaacs in X-Men Age of Apocalypse, the very, very bad 2016 X-Men movie. But I don't think we see Apocalypse here. But I wonder if we get a hint. I was watching when they were in those temple scenes. Like, I do wonder if at some point they pan past the various statues, if we get a Ramatut or an Apocalypse statue in the background of one of these scenes.
Know that the Fox X-Men movies exist in this universe.
Right.
At least they will at some point, because we have seen presumably Charles Xavier played by Patrick Stewart. So there's no reason that I feel like you couldn't allude to it. Maybe Oscar wouldn't want to, because I feel like he probably like doesn't remember it fondly. But like, I think that there's Egypt in Marvel is impossible to think of without thinking of Apocalypse, because so much of Marvel is defined by the X-Men. And ironically, even like the Ramatut stuff, the Kang stuff, that's all way, way down the recognition ladder compared to Apocalypse. So when you have this actor, who also, by the way, we're going to see him presumably inhabit many different characters and heroes and villains and versions, I don't see why there couldn't be a nod or something that is actually more direct, because I think that they've sold this show as kind of like Raiders of the Lost Ark meets Indiana Jones meets the MCU. So I think we're going to see a lot more adventuring and actually going to Egypt, going to these spaces. And in that case, Apocalypse is like an outlier, but it's like, who wouldn't want to see that? Who wouldn't want to catch that Easter egg?
More connections, possible connections to the larger MCU. The idea of chaos magic. There's chaos in Mark. That gets us to, I mean, it's impossible not to think of Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness and the stuff we might see there. The Shumagorath / Gargantos. We keep calling him Shumagorath, but Gargantos in the movie, the Lord of Chaos. Tell us about, what do you think? Do you think that we will get any kind of chaos magic, Lord of Chaos, Gargantos, like breadcrumbs in this?
Recently in the Marvel Comics, they actually retconned Khonshu to make him an elder god, which would sit him alongside Shumagorath and the other elder gods of the Marvel Universe. So that's a connection there. Shumagorath is the Lord of Chaos. In fact, in the first Moon Knight trailer, they actually kind of use Shumagorath's famous video game quote, which is,
"There's chaos in you. Embrace the chaos."
Recently, the first official kind of MCU big dig into chaos magic was that is what Agatha Harkness tells Wanda that she uses.
This is chaos magic, Wanda. And that makes you the Scarlet Witch.
And the Darkhold, that is a chaos magic book. I think it's very likely that the different magics of the MCU kind of come together under that banner. And I think as well, like, the chaos in you thing is really interesting, because obviously it seems like he's talking about the struggle between Mark and Steven, but it could be that he's sensing all these different people from different planes. If Steven is a Nexus or Mark is a Nexus being, because they haven't really made clear who the kind of primary version of the character is in this universe, but whoever it is, if they're a Nexus being, that means that they could be contacting and connected to every single multiverse at the same time, which is incredibly chaotic and is connected to what Wanda can do, again, back to chaos magic. So I think there's definitely something in that. I
think that there is a pretty good chance that this is our introduction into the idea of Nexus characters, or the idea of like multiple characters inhabiting the same body. Okay. More interesting connections, just stuff that I picked up. We mentioned West Coast Avengers, and by the way, that like time travel adventure arc is, I think, West Coast, it starts in like West Coast Avengers 20, I want to say.
And the art in that, the
Al
page
Milgrom
you sent me
killing it.
Of Hawkeye talking to Khonshu is like some of the coolest comic book art I've seen in an age. It's some
Al
cosmic
Milgrom,
shit.
When he really gets fantastical, is just wonderful. Wonderful artist. Okay, so I can't help but notice that, first of all, in the Hawkeye series, as we talked about, one of the places that our two Hawkeyes laid up was the apartment of Moira Brandon, who in the comics is the actress who gives her Rancho Palos Verdes estate to Hawkeye and crew to use as the West Coast Avengers compound. So, okay, we've got her, and they very specifically mentioned her name, and that can only mean we're at some point going to the West Coast. Whether it's, who goes, unclear, whether it's Laura or Clint, but like we're going to the West Coast. Moon Knight has some adventures with the West Coast Avengers in the comics. So we have that connection also with that kind of like time traveling adventure. I wonder, we don't have a team yet. Right? No. That's the one thing that in Phase 4 that we don't have. We've had these team-up movies with Spider-Man No Way Home. It is essentially a team-up between multiple Spider-Men, right? And Doctor Strange and the Multiversal Madness will be some kind of team-up movie, but similarly, it will entail multiple versions of the same characters, right? Whereas a team-up movie, I do wonder if we're not headed towards like a West Coast Avengers at some point.
I think that we kind of vaguely touched on this with Hawkeye, but like in the recent one of the recent Kate Bishop Hawkeye runs, she moves to LA. And I think that there's something with them making Moira her aunt in the show. I think that the version that we get of whatever the next iteration of the Avengers is might be a kind of melding of Young Avengers with West Coast Avengers, and kind of have them based out in California for a change of pace, change of tone. You can kind of draw from some of that wackier West Coast Avengers stuff, because throughout history, they've just had some really cool, weird arcs. The West Coast Avengers is so integral to the stuff we saw in WandaVision, which I know now feels like it was like a million years ago, but that established the tone for these shows, and so much of that came out of that, and a lot of the exploration of what we still have to look at with Wanda and with the White Vision and where he stands now is that all is derived from West Coast Avengers. So I think that's like a really big touch point. And my biggest question is like, are they not establishing a brand new team of Avengers, new Avengers, Young Avengers, West Coast Avengers, Uncanny Avengers, like whatever. Is
Savage Avengers.
Savage, I would rather they keep that one out.
Yeah, keep that one out.
Keep that one in the pocket. But like, is it because their focus right now is like Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and then when the X-Men appear, we get some kind of new Avengers team, and then we have, Avengers versus X-Men, which I think is the big thing like every comic book person wants. But I wonder, because I feel like every other phase has been so defined by the Avengers team, and we have all the pieces here for something new. For a long time it seemed like Captain Marvel would be the Captain America, and we would have these different legacy characters, but that hasn't come together in the way that a lot of us expected. So I'm really interested, because like you said, you made a really great point where you're like, they're almost doing these team up movies because they don't have a core team. And people love the team up movies.
People love
so
the team.
What happens after Doctor Strange? You know, is it a different kind of team? Is it an Illuminati instead of an Avengers? You know, is it a Dark Avengers, which we kind of think that we've been seeing seeded in some of the TV shows? It is an exciting and unpredictable time.
Yeah, we're really in some unexplored territory. It feels like we're flying by the seat of our pants with some of this stuff. One last thing. You mentioned it a little bit. There's something not right about this museum, right? Like,
Yeah.
First of all, Steven's apartment, for somebody who works in the gift shop, is
That's a minimum
fucking-
wage job, baby.
It's
That's a minimum
fucking
wage job.
palatial. Like, it is stacks of books, high ceilings. Like, it is friggin' huge. Now, you could say that's some of his Mark Spector money or whatever, the mercenary. Like, okay, but like, does Mark Spector even exist in this reality?
Yeah.
So
Also, I think you touched on something here, because the number one thing that I think a lot of Moon Knight fans and Moon Knight readers and even casual Moon Knight kind of knower about us were confused about is, in the comics, Stephen Grant is the billionaire,
He's the rich guy.
millionaire, a movie producer, usually, right? Making
latest
a movie.
latest
He's-
iteration
he's
is the
movie producer. But generally, he's the Tony Stark persona.
Right.
He's the Bruce Wayne, right? So people say, oh, well, why would this guy be working in a gift shop? So does this mean that the museum is a front for something else? Is this really what Stephen is experiencing? That I think the apartment is such a good catch that I hadn't really thought about, because like, owning a house in London is a myth. Renting a house in London is a myth.
Yeah.
And so to have that in the center of London when you work a minimum wage job with no benefits and kind of, that is a great little clue that whatever this version of, and that would kind of explain away like Donna, you know, JB, who is the security guard, who I'm sure is gonna play a bigger part and have a kind of more serious role. These characters are like not nice to Stephen, and there doesn't really seem to be a reason.
They're not nice to him,
But they're familiar.
They're familiar, exactly, and not at all surprised with how weird he is about losing time, being forgetful about stuff. Like, they're extremely mean to him, but they're also like not put off by how strange he is acting at times.
Yeah, and it doesn't
Not
seem
at
like
all.
it comes from a place of empathy. It seems like
Yeah.
it comes from like, oh, we expect it. So I really think there might be something interesting to the idea, especially if you're talking about this bubble kind of universe that you were talking about, the pocket universe, you know. I think there's something very interesting to the idea that the museum is a
prison.
fragmented
of
part
something created
something created to distract him. You know, maybe something even created by a different version of Stephen.
Yeah.
To, you know, you just wanted to have a normal life. You don't want the drama. You don't want okay, go and work in a museum where your passions are. And I do think something else that's like interesting to me on a rewatch, right? There are hints in this first episode of Stephen's like deep intelligence and passions and the things that he knows a lot about. And that kind of contradicts the general representation, which is kind of, he's like a bumbling, kind of silly guy. And I think that is also very interesting when we're thinking about like, what is this version that we're seeing and what is really going on behind the kind of curtain?
It's fascinating. An interesting first episode, a little bit of a mess, but with some really intriguing things. And I can't wait to talk about how this could possibly connect to the larger MCU. More with you, Rosie.